And of course, and I start saying, well, I don't know. There's like this massive incidence of sexual violence on campus, and there's this big article in the paper yesterday that Duke students, that 23% of women at Duke have eating disorders, and I mean, just none of this shit sounds like privilege to me, you know. But what's interesting is precisely their incapacity to imagine themselves as anything other than privilege. And the question really is all about what kind of political work that does. Like we were talking about this, I think, like at dinner last night, like that. Mitt Romney makes the 47% speech. And the beauty of American politics, the sort of ugly beauty, to quote Monk, of American politics, is that only 4% of the people actually think that they're in the 47%. Right? So that's hence the lack of effectivity of reciting the story, right? Because nobody thinks he's insulting them. Right? Because everybody's got this like deep commitment to thinking of themselves as privileged, right? You know? Like, remember that Lee Green was, I'm glad to be in America where at least I know I'm free. It's like, okay. Anyway. Fanon's primary concern is with the white usage of pidgin, its effects on privileged blacks who are interpolated by such speech, and then the ensuing commitment of those blacks to speaking good French. Fanon takes great care to emphasize not just that the fact that there are whites who don't talk down to blacks is irrelevant for the study of the effects produced by whites who do, but that the purpose of his study of the Negro and language is to eliminate a number of realities that occur as a function of pathological behavior indexed to an inhuman psychology. He's interested, finally, in how pathological white behavior breeds or fabricates a kind of pathological black behavior. Fanon is interested in acknowledging, isolating, studying, and eradicating what Douglas calls, in a different context, our plantation peculiarities. Moreover, while this process may be initiated by way of a psychological or psychoanalytic discourse predicated on the notion of the inferiority complex, a discourse that might also be discussed as a kind of misfire in language that anticipates that of J.L. Austin, an infelicitous speech act, one that fails ultimately to achieve an intention. Ultimately, Fanon will appeal to a different metaphorics, a different language, the language of biochemistry, or the language of what I've calling, it's kind of a bad phrase, but a kind of bioalchemistry of nothingness, right? A language of and on the experiment's double edge. What if we conceive of the child as having been submitted to the most brutal forms of violent investigation, placed on a kind of endless trial, given over to an interminable testing, the brutality of the biological market in which the self-possession of a body is interdicted by fleshly dispossession, marking that condition where to be grasped, held, owned is also to be studied. But what if we simultaneously conceive of the child as a scientist, one engaged in experiments, and in the meta-experimental undertaking of and in research predicated on the embrace of precisely that dispossessive fleshliness that corresponds to the fullest possible understanding of what Fanon refers to as absolutely nothing. A nothingness without reserve, independent of the desire to show up in or for the conventional optics wherein somebody is delineated and identified. Then, palaver would be best understood as the language of the playground, if the playground is more accurately understood as a laboratory. This means considering palaver or gobbledygook not as degraded forms of the standard, but rather as modes of linguistic experimentation, modes of linguistic theory, given in experimental linguistic practice that have at least two possible effects: the calling into existence of a kind of carceral standard that will have been fabricated in the instance of a whole range of administrative, normative, and regulatory modes and desires, and the equally problematic calling forth of certain acts of tone-deaf imitation, equal parts condensation and brutality, the production of a sound meant to accompany an image or livery of subordination. What's at stake here is the priority of anoriginally insubordinate, juris-generative, as opposed to juridically systemic, linguistic experimentation. Speaking gobbledygook to a black man is insulting if it takes pigeon for gobbledygook. If such a sclerotic understanding and the imprecision that follows from it imagines Pidgin to be something other than a language of study, Fanon bristles at the casualness of such a form of speech, the easy way in which the informal is understood to be the occasion for a kind of brutal informality on the part of the one who arrogantly deigns to understand it. The absence of any intention to give offense is no defense in his estimation, for the absence of any intention not to give offense. One takes no care to avoid the incidental or accidental suffering of the thing. And this is finally evidence of a flaw, a moral defect. Such lack of concern is rightly understood to be pathological. But what must be clearly understood is that it is not Pidgin or Le Petit Nègre that instantiates imprisonment at an uncivilized and primitive level. It is rather the inaccurate and imprecise reflection, wholly outside of any protocol of study, wholly outside of the experimental social, aesthetic, and intellectual modalities that determine the making of the language in the first place, of Pidgin, that constitutes this particular prison house of language. This means we must then discuss the no less carceral effects that attend the disavowal of Pidgin that often attends the righteous refusal of its less than vulgar imitation. Some might say that such imitation is merely an extension of Pidgin's experimental force, but I would argue that it is more precisely understood as always in service, always enacting the exaltation of the standard. In this instance, imitation is the sincerest form of brutality. What remains is to consider what it is for Fanon to have felt himself lapsing. Remember that he talks about? Okay. So now some more long quotes from the same chapter. When I meet a German or a Russian speaking bad French, I try to indicate through gestures the information he is asking for. But in doing so, I am careful not to forget that he has a language of his own, a country, and that perhaps he is a lawyer or an engineer back home. Whatever the case, he is a foreigner with different standards. There's nothing comparable when it comes to the black man. He has no culture, no civilization, and no long historical past. Perhaps that is why today's blacks want desperately to prove to the white world the existence of a black civilization. Whether he likes it or not, the black man has to wear the livery the white man has fabricated for him. Second quote. All they ask of the black man is to be a good nigger. The rest will follow on its own. Making him speak Pidgin is tying him to an image, snaring him, imprisoning him as the eternal victim of his own essence, of a visible appearance for which he is not responsible. And of course, just as the Jew who is lavish with his money is suspect, so the black man who quotes Montesquieu must be watched. Let me make myself clear. Watched insofar as he might start something. I do not contend that the black student is suspect to his peers or his professors, but outside university circles there is an army of fools. And of course, we know that inside university circles there's a bigger army, maybe. It is a question not of educating them, but of teaching the black man not to be a slave of their archetypes. The fact is, and I'm skipping a bit, the fact is that the European has a set idea of the black man, and there is nothing more exasperating than to hear, how long have you lived in France? You speak such good French. I mean, let's just stop for a minute and pause and acknowledge the many, many times that many of us here have heard precisely this such a formulation. We shouldn't pass over it in silence. We should acknowledge it and breathe, take a deep breath and sigh, and allow yourself